You take the case of the last war in Lebanon. A lot of Israel's artillery happened to have been located near Arab villages in Israel. And then the question became whether it was intentional or they were simply deploying artillery in the available areas. Hard to tell. So number one, a lot of the language is ambiguous. Number two, Palestine, Israel are the most heavily monitored area in the world by human rights organizations. There are the big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and then there's this whole slew of local organizations, each of which churns out one report after another. It's very difficult to keep up with. But you would assume so many different organizations, so many different research staffs, you would assume there are going to be differences of opinion about what's actually happening. And then number three, a lot of human rights work is just very vulnerable to human error. Because what is human rights work? It's somebody going out into the field, observing a demonstration, and trying to figure out, did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And did the Israelis initiate the clash? And if they did, were they in a life-threatening situation? And if they were, did they first fire warning shots? And then if they did, were they aiming at the legs, the torso, the head? In human rights work, that all makes a difference. And this is a sophisticated Brown University audience, so you all know the film Rashomon by Kurosawa. How many of you know it? That's very impressive. I'm very surprised. This is a sophisticated audience. Or you already know the young age How to Lie. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands because of a certain respect for truth, the Rashomon is several people observing the same incident and then in retrospect remembering it altogether differently. And so you would expect that people observing the same demonstration would remember it differently. Or that's plausible. And one of my own surprises, and I do mean a surprise, I had gone through at one point, I was writing something, and I went through several thousands of pages of human rights reports over a 20-year period from the beginning of what's called the First Intifada in 1987 up until roughly 2005. And there was a huge amount of material to sift through, and I was genuinely surprised that literally, and I'm not fearful of a polygraph being put to my wrist at this moment, I was quite surprised that over a 20-year period, thousands of pages of reports from multiple human rights organizations, literally, I was able to find only one case of one demonstration on one afternoon in one city where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened. And the point on which they disagreed happened to have been itself quite trivial. There's no dispute, no controversy about what this record shows. Okay, what does this all mean in concrete practical reality? Let's take the most common aspect, in my opinion, not the most important, but certainly the one that's most salient, the question of fatalities during the Israel-Palestine conflict. As some of you know, January 2006, the Palestinian people, in a certified, internationally monitored election, elect the Islamic movement Hamas into power in the occupied territories. Immediately as they come to power, Israel, and then followed by the United States, impose these brutal economic sanctions among the Palestinian people, the justification being several-fold for our purposes now, the main claim being that Hamas is a terrorist organization, terrorism is illegal under international law, and that for the Palestinians to return to the community of civilized nations, their elected government has to renounce terrorism. And in fact, it seems to me that's pretty much a no-brainer. Terrorism is illegal under international law. Terrorism being the standard definition, the targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal or a political aim. And so there's no point in belaboring what it seems to me is obvious. Terrorism is illegal. The targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal is immoral and illegal. So there's no point, as I said, to belaboring it, and it would be, in my opinion, obtuse to quarrel about it. No qualifications apart from the obvious one. Namely, if you apply a principle across the board to all parties to a conflict, it's a moral or legal principle. But if you only apply it to one party to the conflict, it ceases to be a moral or legal principle. It becomes, as everyone in this room knows, a hypocritical principle. And so trying as we would want to at an institution of higher learning committed to principles of truth and justice, let's apply the principle across the board and see what the record looks like. Let's start with the raw material. The second Intifada begins September 2000. If you look at the numbers up until today, about 4,700 Palestinians have been killed and about 1,000 Israelis have been killed. So strictly in terms of numbers, the ratio is now about 4.7 to 1 in terms of fatalities. That's, as they say, the first level of analysis. The second level of analysis is, of course, not to look at total numbers of fatalities, but to look at numbers of fatalities who are civilian on both sides, because according to the laws of war, it's legitimate to target combatants. So we look at the number of civilians killed. It's about, the ratio is about 3 to 4 Palestinians killed for each Israeli killed. So if we're again looking at the second level of analysis, it's still, the imbalance is quite pronounced against the Palestinians. Nonetheless, there's still a third level of analysis, which those of you who in the audience who are more acute, not to mention disturbed by my remarks, would want to make. And the third level of analysis, in my opinion, is perfectly legitimate. Namely, isn't there a difference between Palestinians targeting Israeli civilians and Israel unintentionally killing Palestinian civilians? That's the conventional argument that's made. We shouldn't sneer or snicker, I think. We should try to treat it seriously and see where it leads us. Or you take the case of Jeffrey Goldberg, who was the New Yorker's correspondent in the occupied territories. I guess he's now with Atlantic Magazine. In his recent book, I think he's only written one, in his book Prisoners, Jeffrey Goldberg has a very distinguished career. Before he was a correspondent for the New Yorker, he was a prison guard for Israel, which it seems to me is a perfect qualification for being a correspondent for the New Yorker. And by the way, a torturer. That's a fact. Mr. Goldberg, in his book Prisoners, he recounts an argument he had with a Hamas member, and he says to the Hamas member at one point in indignation and frustration, he says, "For God's sake, we don't try to kill children." The obvious point being that the children we kill, it's an accident, but you target Palestinian children, Israeli children. So again, let's look at the record. The record shows about 900 Palestinian children have been killed during the Second Intifada, which is more than the total number of Israeli civilians killed. The total number of Israeli civilians killed is about 710, of whom about 120 were children. So more Palestinian children have been killed than the total number of Israeli civilians killed. And just comparing children with children, the ratio is about 7 to 1. So our first conclusion based on the raw material is or raw data, for the want of trying to kill Palestinian children, it would seem that Israelis were awfully good at it. But is it even true that Israel doesn't deliberately kill Palestinian children? Not according to human rights organizations. So if you open up to the reports of, say, Amnesty International, they write, quote, that on many occasions, Israel deliberately targeted Palestinian demonstrators, of whom many were children, in fact, overwhelmingly children. And then they say in other cases, Israel used indiscriminate, excessive, and disproportionate force. For example, of the 37 Palestinian children killed in the first month of the Second Intifada, of the 37 Palestinian children killed during the month of October 2000, 20 died from a direct bullet shot to the head. Well, let's make the best case for Israel. That's how a lawyer, or I think an honest debater, would pursue the matter, not the easy case. Let's take the best case, namely the question of indiscriminate killings, not deliberate killings. But under international law, indiscriminate killing is no different than a deliberate or intentional killing, because the principle is, it's a fairly uncomplicated principle, the inevitable and foreseeable consequences of an act count as an intention. The inevitable and foreseeable consequences of an act count as an intention. So if you spray a crowd indiscriminately with machine gun fire, the inevitable and foreseeable consequence is that civilians will be killed. And therefore, it counts as an intention. Not a particularly complicated idea. There are some people in the audience now who are very disgruntled by what I have to say. The indignation is arising in them, and they have decided the point has come to resolve this matter for once and for all. And one of the audience members rushes up to the platform, pulls out a dagger, and plunges it into my heart. And I am prematurely, at any rate in my opinion, dispatched to my maker. Brown University has this person arrested, I hope. And although it's too late to hope, the person goes before the judge, and the judge asks, do you have any extenuating explanation? And the person says, well, I didn't intend to kill ex-Professor Finkelstein. I was just testing the sharpness of the blade of my dagger. Well, obviously that explanation is ludicrous, at least I would hope it would be, because the inevitable and foreseeable consequence of plunging a dagger into my heart is, alas, I'm going to die. And so since that's the inevitable and foreseeable consequence, it is deliberate, exactly what Hamas is accused of. Okay, that's still at a level of abstraction. We're dealing with my heart. Well, let's now proceed to look at the conflict. What does it look like in reality, in the real world? We'll take the case of a wonderful Israeli journalist for Haaretz newspaper, person I genuinely admire, and as a human being I like, which is not always the same thing. His name is Gideon Levy, and Mr. Levy is covering the occupied territories, Gaza, November 2006, a fairly typical day in Gaza. Israel is firing indiscriminately artillery shells into Beit Hanun. And this is what Mr. Levy has to say. Someone who throws burning matches into a forest can't claim he didn't mean to set it on fire. And anyone who bombards residential neighborhoods with artillery can't claim he didn't mean to kill innocent civilians. Therefore, it takes considerable gall and cynicism to dare to claim that Israel Defense Forces did not intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. I particularly like that dispatch, not only for its accuracy, but how, in simple journalistic fashion, he translates the legal principle, I suppose, unconsciously. He's simply using common sense, which is what legal principles are supposed to do. When they start drifting too far away from what common sense tells you, then something is going awry. So what does he say? If you fire indiscriminately into a civilian neighborhood, it takes gall and cynicism to dare to claim that you did not, and what's his word, intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. The inevitable and foreseeable consequence counts as an intention. Okay, well, where does that leave us? We could look at it abstractly. You take Israel's leading authority in international law, Yoram Dinstein, president of Tel Aviv University, very smart guy. Unfortunately, when it comes to questions bearing on Israel, he's a wretched apologist, but as a student of international law, very impressive. You open up to his standard work on the laws of war, and he says, there is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of, a premeditated attack against civilians, and reckless use of force, which, making the best case for Israel, is what it's accused of. He says, and now I'm quoting him, they are equally forbidden. So, where does that leave us? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are, one, Israeli terrorism is about 3 to 4 times as lethal, and two, no demand, let alone sanctions, has been imposed on Israel to renounce terrorism. Well, if Israeli terrorism is several times as lethal as Palestinian terrorism, and no demand, let alone sanctions, is imposed on Israel, then it seems to me fairly obvious that's not a legal or moral principle. That's a hypocritical principle and deserves contempt. Well, some of you may agree so far. Some of you who are generous will agree so far. It doesn't seem to be that complicated. The numbers seem to be pretty precise. The law fairly, in these cases, pretty uncontroversial. A broad consensus. But it can't be true that this conflict is not difficult to resolve. That's very hard to believe. It's been going on twice, or I should say its most recent phase, has been going on twice as long as about 3/4 of the people in this room. Most of you are in the age 20, and it's been 40 years. That's really quite extraordinary. You take your mind like a reel, a movie reel, and you go backward, and you go from age 2, 3, your first birthday party, 2nd grade, your 4th grade teacher, your communion, bas mitzvah, bar mitzvah, sweet 16, this and that, and then you double it, and it's still going on. And can it really be that simple? How can that be? Oh, let's look at the record. The record shows, for at least the past 30 years, there's been a consensus, the entire international community, on how to resolve the conflict. Some of you say, well, that's speculation. But it's not. We have a record. It's very easy to look at. Everyone in this room is computer savvy and literate. All you have to do is go to Google and type in peaceful settlement of Palestine question. That's the title of the UN resolution that's voted on every year in the United Nations General Assembly. And the vote's quite remarkable. What does the vote show? Let's take the last year of the Soviet Empire, 1989. The terms, I should say, everyone in this room knows. The terms are what's called the two-state settlement, namely a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967 because of that fundamental principle of international law, inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war. And then there's another principle of international law, Article 2 of the UN Charter. It's inadmissible to threaten or use force against any member state of the United Nations. So, neighboring Arab states, a newly formed state of Palestine, they have to recognize Israel's right to be free from the threat or use of force. Those are the principles. Full withdrawal, full recognition of Israel. Those are the essential principles. All right, what's the vote? 1989, the vote is 151-3. The whole world on one side, Israel, the United States, and the island state of Dominica on the other side. Time doesn't allow me to go through all of the votes, so let's just do it quickly. 1997, the vote, 155-2. 1998, the vote, 154-2. 2002, the vote, 160-4. 2003, the vote, 160-6. 2004, 161-7. 2006, 157-7. This current year just passed, the vote, 161-7. Now, some of you in this audience who are math whizzes and have a critical mind will no doubt have noticed that the vote leapt all the way from 2 to 7. And it's true. It did go from 2 to 7. Traditionally, it's been the United States and Israel. In recent years, they've been joined by Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. And that's it. The whole world on one side, and Israel and the United States and the other countries. Some of you, not all of you know those other countries. I have to admit that although once I taught the topic, I did not know them either. I think suffice to say, even though it may not be politically correct, the total populations of Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu can fit in the empty seats in this room, and there would be room left over. Okay, that's the record. And that's been the record since right after the June 1967 war. I recently came across an article by a renowned authority in international law from 1970 called The Middle East Problem. The fellow's name, older people will remember him, Quincy Wright. Anyone remember Quincy Wright? Yeah, he was at, I think he was at Harvard at the time. Very smart guy, very respected. This is what he wrote in 1970. 1970, bear in mind. In view of the acceptance of Resolution 242 by the adjacent Arab states except Syria, the major obstacle to progress seems to be the refusal of Israel to do so and to agree to withdraw from occupied territories. That was the problem. 1970, Israel's refusal to withdraw from occupied territories. Fast forward to 2006. Ex-President Jimmy Carter writes a book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. What does he conclude in what was said to be a highly controversial book? Indeed, it was said to be an outrageous book. And what did he conclude? Quote, "Peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when Israel is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders." The same problem in 1970 is the same problem 40 years ago. Israel's refusal to withdraw and accept its legal borders. Well, what does it mean concretely? When Hamas was elected into power, the second major allegation against Hamas was it practiced terrorism and it refused to recognize the state of Israel. As a principle, again, it's uncontroversial. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, and therefore it's illegal for there to be threats or use of force against it. No point in arguing the obvious. And Hamas's record for a time was ambiguous. You could say sometimes they made harsh statements about Israel, and you can say in more recent times, since 2006, their record has been fairly consistent, supporting the two-state settlement along the lines of the international consensus. So let's take the worst case, that in the past they have made ambiguous and in some cases harsh statements. All right, but what's Israel's record? No Israeli government has ever recognized a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border. No Israeli official has ever recognized a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967. So while these brutal sanctions are imposed on Hamas because it allegedly refuses in words to recognize Israel, in practice, the state of Israel, not words, but in practice, it's building a wall which illegally annexes between 10 and 13% of the West Bank. It's de facto annexed the Jordan Valley, another 10 to 20% of the West Bank. De facto annexed, well not de facto, de jure annexed Jerusalem, cut up the West Bank into 6 major fragments and multiple minor fragments, and has left the Palestinians approximately 50% of the West Bank on which to exercise their alleged right to self-determination. What's left? Israel's main newspaper, Haaretz, writes, between the eastward expansion of the Israeli settlements, the westward expansion of the settlements, the Palestinians are left with no territory on which to establish a state. And yet the only issue that arises in public life is why don't the Palestinians recognize Israel in words, while Israel is dismantling the Palestinian state in practice. That's the record as far as I can tell. Obviously, going through it in a rapid fashion. Then where does the controversy come from, if that's true? The controversy, it seems to me, there are 2 aspects to it. Part of the controversy, in my opinion, a small part, it is legitimate. We shouldn't pretend there are no aspects of the conflict which are controversial. Let's take the one which looms largest and which I haven't yet addressed, namely the question of the Palestinian refugees. Let's start with basics. You can agree on facts, but disagree in your moral judgments. That should be fairly straightforward. Your moral judgments don't spring from the facts of a situation. You take a case like Benny Morris. He says, I agree the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948, but he says, I think it was a good thing. He says sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. He points to the United States and he said, wasn't it a good thing that the native population was, to use his words, annihilated? Had it not been for the annihilation, again his word, of the native population, he says, you couldn't have had the great American Republic. And therefore, he says, it was a good thing. And he says it was a good thing in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, because then you got the Jewish state. And in fact, Mr. Morris is very emphatic. He becomes more emphatic as time passes, that the main error Israel committed in 1948 was that it didn't expel all the Arabs from Palestine. The ethnic cleansing, in his words, was lamentably only a partial one. It was unfortunately not a comprehensive one. If, he says, all the Arabs were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, we wouldn't have a Palestinian problem today. You know, there's some wisdom to that. Germany today doesn't have a Jewish problem. In fact, in his most recent interview, Mr. Morris says the problem now is maybe we have to nuke Iran. He doesn't want a conventional war. We have to nuke Iran, he says, in order to put the Arabs in their place for a few generations to come. Now, you can't say Morris's moral judgments are wrong in the way that you can say facts are wrong. You could say they are Nazi moral judgments, and I think that would be accurate, but you can't say they are wrong moral judgments. If you leave Mr. Morris aside for the moment, and you return to the moral universe of normal human beings, you still have complications, and we should be honest about those complications. Because people can agree in their factual judgments, their moral judgments, and their legal judgments, but still disagree in their political judgments. Now that sounds a little bit more complicated, because don't our political judgments come from our legal and moral judgments? Not really, not always. Let's take a case with most of you are familiar with, at least by name. You take the case of Professor Chomsky. His view is factually the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. That's what the scholarship shows. Morally, of course, ethnic cleansings are abominations, not worth belaboring. Legally, Palestinians, of course, have the right of return, which in fact, it may come as a surprise to some people in the room, that's also an uncontroversial issue. 2000, 2001, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they issue official statements on the question of the right of return. And they write unambiguously, uncontroversially, of course, Palestinians and subsequent generations which have maintained links with the land, that's a technical language, have the right of return. And Professor Chomsky, not one to slight international law, they have the right of return legally. But then there's a separate question. We can agree on the factual, moral, and legal issue, but then there's a political question. Chomsky says, politically, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that Palestinians will be able ever, because there's insufficient political will, to ever implement the right of return. And therefore, he says, I think it's immoral to tell Palestinian refugees in Lebanon that they're going to be returning home when you know and they know they're not. Now, my own view, for what it's worth, is that's a political judgment. And a political judgment means you have to weigh 1,000 different factors, and then decide on what's feasible, what's possible, and what's not. If you reach the conclusion, as Professor Chomsky, weighing the factors, if you reach the conclusion it's really not feasible, it's not possible, then I think he's right. It's immoral to give people hope when there is no hope.